And thank you so much. Before I begin, I want to just thank so much the CEO of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, Mustafa Farooq, for being here with us as well. On the commemoration, on the anniversary of the horrible, horrible tragedy, the horrible attack, the horrible killing of 6 Muslim brothers and 1 brother who was paralyzed. Remembering that Quebec attack reminds us of the importance to be vigilant in the face of Islamophobia and hate in general. And I want to make a clear point that Islamophobia, like hate in general, once allowed to take hold, spreads like a fire and consumes everyone. And that is why it is all our responsibilities to fight back against hate. And while today we'll hear a lot of politicians and leaders express their condolences and their heartfelt sadness at what happened, and it is important to remember the pain, it is not good enough to just remember what happened and to commemorate that horrible tragedy by reflecting on the lives lost. We need to go beyond. We need to go beyond to ensure that this never happens again. We need to take clear and concrete steps to end this form of hate and the violence that flows from it. It has to be ended. And in order to do that, the concrete steps that we need to take include dismantling white supremacy and extreme right-wing groups who are clearly tied to hate, hateful rhetoric, and inciting violence. We can look at the violence that we've seen already in our country and know very clearly that the radicalization that comes from white supremacy and that comes from extreme right-wing groups directly inspires the violence that takes the lives of our fellow Canadians. And so while Justin Trudeau has said some nice words, it is not enough if he doesn't take action, concrete action, to dismantling white supremacy and to dismantling these extreme right-wing groups. So I'm really proud to say that the NCCM is working with our member of Parliament, Matthew Green, on a piece of legislation that will give more tools in the fight against white supremacy and extreme right-wing groups. That we need to make sure that social media giants aren't allowed to police themselves, that we put in place clear lines around what is hate and what is hateful rhetoric and what is inciting violence, and that is immediately removed and is not allowed to spread and radicalize people. We need concrete steps to combat the real threat of violence to our fellow Canadians, the people in our country. And in doing so, we are doing our part to combat hate, not just here in Canada, but around the world. Because we know that some of the hate groups spread their message across the world. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Mustafa Farooq for his tireless efforts in raising these concerns. We did a joint press conference earlier this months ago, where we talked about the importance of fighting and dismantling white supremacist groups. We need to continue that battle. We need to continue to stand up against hate to make sure it does not take hold. It is not given any space to breathe. It is not allowed to spread. And so we can keep people safe. Thank you once again. En français, je veux dire que c'est tellement important qu'on fait face à la racisme systémique, mais en particulier, aujourd'hui, on parle de l'attentat à Québec. Et c'est tellement important de souvenir cette violence, de souvenir les vies qu'on a perdues. Mais en même temps, ce n'est pas suffisant de seulement parler de ces événements. Il faut prendre des actions concrètes, des mesures concrètes. Et je veux souligner l'importance de faire face aux organismes extrême droit et suprématie blanche, parce que c'est tellement lié avec la violence contre la communauté musulmane. L'islamophobie crée pas seulement des peurs, mais ça incite la violence. Donc aujourd'hui, dans la mémoire des êtres humains, de nos proches, de nos amis, de familles qu'on a perdues à Québec, on doit réengager, de dire on va se battre contre la suprématie blanche et la radicalisation qui a inspiré ces sortes de violences. Donc, je veux saluer et remercier mon ami Mustafa Farooq pour son travail essentiel dans cette bataille. et aussi l'importance de le projet de loi que Mustafa et Matthew Green travaillent pour s'assurer qu'on a des outils suffisants pour faire face à cette sorte de suprématie blanche et radicalisation. Donc ça, c'est essentiel et les belles paroles, ce n'est pas suffisant. On a besoin d'action, on doit agir pour prévenir ce sorte de violence dans l'avenir. Thank you so much. I'd like to pass the mic on to Mustafa Farooq. Thank you so much, Mustafa.
Thank you so much, Mr. Singh. Today is January 29th. Today marks 4 years since the horrific attack at the Quebec City Mosque. Ibrahima Berry, Mamadou Tanner Berry, Khalid Balkasimi, Abu Bakr Thabti, Abdul Karim Hassan, Azzuddin Sufyan. On that day, we lost 6 brave and beautiful people. They had families, they had loved ones. They were lost at the hands of a man with hate in his heart, motivated by Islamophobia, a symbol of the potent force of white supremacy. Yesterday, the federal government made a laudable move. They answered calls that many had been advocating for by designating today in the federal calendar as a day to commemorate the Quebec City mosque shooting and a day of action against Islamophobia. Given that, let us talk about action against Islamophobia. A major part of our battle against Islamophobia is grounding it in an action plan to dismantle white supremacist groups. While the Quebec City mosque shooting was the largest attack on a religious institution in modern Canadian history, we cannot forget that white supremacy, imperialism, and colonialism formed the bedrock of intentional degradation in this land directed against Indigenous folks, on our Black brothers and sisters, on the Chinese head tax, or the internment of Japanese Canadians. That is why our push now to dismantle white supremacist groups, as these groups in Canada rear their heads again in terms of newly mobilized forces, as they did down south in the events of the Capitol that we all saw, is a necessary bipartisan push. We have been working with each federal party in developing out solutions and methodologies for solving this problem. We have engaged in positive conversation with Minister Blair and the Prime Minister, and in positive conversation with the leader of Canada's official opposition, Erin O'Toole. But today I want to thank Mr. Jagmeet Singh for bringing forward clear policy items to the table, including reforms around online hate and the consideration of new legislation to be put forward by MP Matthew Green. We're not here to talk about looking for words or looking for symbolism. Standing up against white supremacist violence doesn't deserve laudits. It is the bare minimum of what we expect from any Canadian, let alone our leaders. Now, Mr. Singh's proposal on putting forward new legislation that addresses white supremacist groups as white supremacist groups is a critical one. For too long, we have lived entirely within the realm of thinking about the utilization of anti-terror legislation as the only tool. That's been a problem, not least because the terror listing provisions were and have been used historically to target communities of color only. In fact, until a year and a half ago, there wasn't a single white supremacist group on that list. And to be clear, until we see a needed total overhaul of the way that anti-terrorism legislation works, we support the listing of terrorist groups like the Base or the Proud Boys on the list. That's why we were very supportive in seeing the NDP-led unanimous consent motion passed this week. With the introduction of new legislation of the type that Mr. Singh is talking about today, could do is extraordinary and has been the reasons that many of us have been pushing for it. It can address this rising need, this rising challenge through a modern approach and can deal effectively with groups that gather to intimidate Canadians, like the Soldiers of Odin, that have assaulted Indigenous, Black, and Muslim folks, but according to our national security establishment, don't meet the test for being listed under the anti-terror provisions. Last year, we added a name onto a litany of folks from my community, that's excluding folks from all the other communities that have appear to have been lost to us by what appear to have been white supremacist violence. On September 12th, 2020, Mohammed Aslam Zavis, the caretaker of the IMO Mosque in Etobicoke and a man I was blessed to know, was slain by a man with connections to the O9A, a white supremacist neo-Nazi cult. Let there not be a single more name added on. I urge all members of parliament, including all federal leaders, to consider moving to ensure that legislation and the reforms of the kind that Mr. Singh is putting forward are properly considered and adopted. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mustafa. I really appreciate your words. And I just want to highlight again how important today is to not just remember the lives lost, to do dignity and honor to those lives lost and to the families that continue to mourn their lost loved ones. We need action. And that's why we're proposing concrete steps, improved tools to help us fight and dismantle white supremacy, tools to protect people from radicalization so that the hateful rhetoric is not allowed to spread and inspire more hate and importantly, most importantly, more violence. We are committed to this. And again, want to thank Mustafa for his words today. And now I'd like to pass the mic over to Nina and ask Nina to MC the remaining portion where there may be questions from media. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Singh. Donc, si vous avez une question, je vous demanderai d'utiliser la fonction « Lever la main » qui se trouve au bas de votre page. If you have a question, I would just ask you to use the function « Raise Hand » that you will find at the bottom of your page. And we will go ahead with the first question. Peter from CBC, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Perfect, thank you. Mr. Singh, I just wanted to start off. I clicked on the press conference a few minutes before it started, but I seemed to come in halfway through your English comments. I don't know if anyone else had that issue, but I didn't get a chance to hear specifically at the beginning what it was you were calling for. And my French isn't great enough. I don't know if you could send me a transcript or if you wouldn't mind repeating it now in case anyone else had that issue.
Certainly. Well, I'll start that off the top and we'll still give you two questions. So today I'm with the CEO for the National Council of Canadian Muslims, Mustafa Farooq. And on the anniversary of the Quebec attack, which left six members of families, loved ones dead and one paralyzed, we're calling on not just the words of remembrance, but we're calling on action. And specifically, this type of attack and other attacks like it are linked to white supremacy and extreme right-wing groups. So we are working on legislation to provide more tools to dismantle white supremacy and to dismantle extreme right-wing groups which inspire this type of hate. As folks know, Alexandre Bissonnette, who was the attacker in Quebec, was inspired by and followed Donald Trump, other extreme right-wing groups and white supremacist groups on Twitter that inspired his violence and his actions. We know there's many groups operating in Canada which are extreme right or white supremacy or both. And they put out hateful rhetoric, they put out divisive messages and inspire violence. And they're operating now, the 3 Percenters is one example, with a clear goal of Islamophobia, training with weapons, and their goal is to expound this conspiracy theory and this paranoia towards Muslims, and that needs to end. And so today we're talking about real concrete tools, this legislation we're working on, which will give increased tools to fighting white supremacy and to dismantling it and dismantling extreme right-wing groups to protect people. So in the memory of those lives lost, we commit to protecting and ensuring that further lives are not lost.
Thank you. Can I just ask, can you give us any sense of what specifically is, are you saying you're working on legislation, but you don't have the specifics yet? Am I to understand that?
We have legislation that's in the works right now with Member of Parliament Matthew Green and Mustafa Farooq, who I mentioned is the CEO of NCCM, working on it. These tools include giving more specific, what we're addressing is the fact that current definitions of hate or current definitions of terrorist groups don't specifically respond to white supremacy or extreme right-wing groups. So we want to provide better tools in terms of policing better tools in terms of social media content when it comes to hateful rhetoric, so that we can tackle not just the groups themselves, but also their messages, the radicalization that they are engaging in when they put out hate mixed with violence messages.
And when will you have this legislation ready for us to look at?
We'll give you a heads up as soon as it's prepared to be released.
Can you give us a sense? Is it in a few weeks, or are we talking months? Like, how imminent is it?
Yeah, we can follow up with you and give you that timeline.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Prochain, j'ai Marc-André Boulian avec TVA Québec. C'est à vous.
Bonjour, M. Singh, vous m'entendez bien?
Oui, bonjour.
Oui, donc vous avez parlé qu'il doit y avoir là, des actions, on ne doit pas seulement parler, on doit faire des actions pour régler tout ça. Il y a le Centre culturel islamique de Québec qui demande là, à ce qu'Ottawa interdise les armes de poing comme il a été utilisé là, par le tireur. Est-ce que vous trouvez que Justin Trudeau se traîne les pieds dans ce dossier? Est-ce que ça devrait aller plus vite?
Oui, et je suis d'accord qu'il traîne les pieds. Aussi qu'on parle de l'attentat de Polytechnique, les mêmes enjeux, c'était une limitation des sortes des armes à feu. C'est quelque chose que la communauté a demandé. Ils ont raison. Et on appuie cette demande en général, l'importance de limiter ces sortes des armes à feu qui leur seul but, c'est de tuer les personnes. Donc, c'est quelque chose que la communauté demande et on est d'accord en général avec ce principe. Mais on veut aussi souligner l'importance de régler le problème des groupes extrême droite et de suprématie blanche qui inspirent ce sorte de violence. Donc, ça, c'est aussi, dans mon avis, le plus important enjeu, la plus importante étape qu'on peut prendre pour prévenir ce sorte de violence dans l'avenir.
Et justement, sur ce dernier point-là que vous avez abordé, est-ce que le gouvernement Trudeau, encore là, agit suffisamment rapidement? Est-ce que ça traîne là aussi sur la radicalisation?
Oui, parce qu'ils ont mentionné l'importance de donc deux choses. Premièrement, le fait qu'ils ont annoncé qu'aujourd'hui, c'est une journée nationale, ça c'est une chose positive. Mustafa Farooq a dit la même chose, je reconnais ça. Mais au-delà de ça, ils ont dit que les médias sociaux, c'est une plateforme où les extrêmes droits, les groupes extrêmes droits ou les groupes de suprématie blanche utilisent les médias sociaux pour promouvoir leur message. Et ça, c'est un grand problème. Donc, le Premier ministre Justin Trudeau a dit que oui, il faut faire quelque chose, mais effectivement, il n'a pas agi. Donc, ce qu'on exige le gouvernement de faire, c'est de mettre en œuvre des mesures concrètes pour limiter les messages haineux et qui inspirent la violence et de prendre la responsabilité d'arrêter ces sortes des messages sur les médias sociaux et d'avoir le pouvoir de dire on doit enlever ces sortes de messages si quelqu'un le poste sur une plateforme de médias sociaux.
Merci beaucoup.
Je vous en prie.
Merci beaucoup. Prochain, j'ai Boris Proulx avec Le Devoir. C'est à vous.
Bonjour, M. Singh.
Bonjour.
Ma question concerne les messages haineux en ligne. On sait que le gouvernement est sur le point de déposer son projet de loi qui encadre les géants du numérique comme Facebook. Facebook va tout à l'heure passer en comité parlementaire. Est-ce que, selon vous, on s'attaque assez à ces messages en ligne et qu'est-ce que vous auriez préféré en termes d'encadrement?
Oui. Donc, premièrement, le gouvernement libéral a dit ça dans le passé qu'ils vont agir, mais c'était trop longtemps. On sait qu'en Australie, le gouvernement a dit qu'ils vont utiliser le pouvoir d'enlever les messages haineux qui inspirent la violence tout de suite. Et ici, au Canada, le premier pas, c'était de dire on va donner la responsabilité aux géants de web eux-mêmes de décider c'est quoi acceptable ou non. Et on n'est pas d'accord avec cette position. Donc, c'est encourageant que peut-être on va avoir des détails d'un projet de loi, mais il faut agir tout de suite et il faut être clair. Si un message est haineux et promouvoir la haine, on doit l'enlever tout de suite.
Est-ce que, selon vous, l'attentat à la Mosquée de Québec a rapport à cette question-là? Autrement dit, est-ce que les géants du numérique, est-ce que Facebook, Twitter, les autres médias sociaux ont un rôle à jouer, ont quelque chose à voir avec ces actes-là haineux? Et est-ce qu'il y en a plus qui pourraient se passer dans le futur si on n'agit pas?
Oui, ils ont une responsabilité aussi de s'assurer que les messages haineux et les messages qui inspirent la violence ne sont pas partagés sur leur plateforme, mais on ne veut pas dire que c'est eux qui vont auto-réguler eux-mêmes. C'est la responsabilité du gouvernement de prendre la rôle, de protéger la population en disant que s'il y a un message haineux qui inspire la violence, on va l'enlever, on va l'arrêter. Ça, c'est important et ça, c'est pourquoi notre parti propose un projet de loi qui va donner plus d'outils pour faire face à cette sorte de problème, cette suprématie blanche et les groupes extrême droite.
Si je peux permettre juste un petit suivi, votre projet de loi va inclure des mesures sur les géants du web comme Facebook, Twitter, les médias sociaux?
Oui, on va inclure les mesures pour parler de comment on peut arrêter la propagation de ce sorte de message.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais juste rappeler tout le monde que si vous avez une question, je vous inviterai d'utiliser la fonction lever la main au bas de la page. Just want to remind everybody, if you have a question, to please use the raise hand function at the bottom of the page. Next, I have Cormac Misweeney with the City News. Please go for it.
Hi, Mr. Singh. The Prime Minister reportedly going to be announcing this morning new travel restrictions that will include quarantine hotels like we've seen in Australia, where people coming back into Canada will have to, on their own dime, stay in a quarantine hotel. I'm wondering what your reaction is to this. Do you think that that's enough in terms of trying to curb international travel and deal with the COVID variants that we have? And what other measures you would like to see put in place to try and protect Canadians in regards to international travel?
Thanks for the question. We've said that we support this type of measure. Australia has used it, as well as New Zealand. It has been effective in limiting the spread internationally of COVID-19. And we're seeing more and more evidence now that that is a real concern. And a lot of people were worried that they've had to sacrifice so much they couldn't travel, let alone internationally. They couldn't travel within their own province, but between cities. People weren't able to see loved ones within the same city, but it was much easier to travel internationally. So having some sort of a protection in place like that is important. It is something we've supported. The quarantining is something we support. But I do want to highlight, though, we also can't forget the importance of paid sick leave. We fought for it, we obtained it, but we found there was certain gaps in the proposal that the Liberals put forward. And we need to fix that. Experts have said that workplace transmission is one of the highest risks for transmission, and that paid sick leave is one of the best tools to stop that transmission. So we're again going to continue to fight to improve paid sick leave.
And just as a follow-up, wondering in terms of domestic travel, some provinces are starting to take measures about domestic travel, Manitoba and others. Do you think that we should see any sort of domestic, from the federal point of view, any sort of domestic travel restrictions? And would you support using the Emergencies Act to do that, to try and restrict people's movements within our own country?
We've seen that provinces have done this. Just to this point directly, the Atlantic provinces created the Atlantic bubble to great effect. It helped reduce the spread. They were already doing okay in terms of numbers, or very well in terms of numbers. And then the Atlantic bubble, or the travel restriction into the Atlantic provinces with the mandatory quarantines, certainly helped them out. So looking at ways that we could, right now, I think the message has got to be that we've got to limit our travel as much as possible. The message to everybody: if you don't need to go somewhere, don't. But in terms of using the Emergencies Act or taking another step around those restrictions, I've not taken that position yet.
Thank you very much. Next, I have Althea Raj with the Huffington Post. Please go ahead.
Hi, I have a question. A Green Party complaint. So Elizabeth May says that the parties are blocking her and the other members of the Green Party's ability to ask a question, basically that they haven't agreed to let the Greens ask a question on Wednesday, so a question to the Prime Minister, since the last election. But she says prior to 2019, there was, I guess, an understanding between the parties that Elizabeth could ask a question when she was alone in the House. Why is the NDP opposed to giving the Greens a question?
You know, this is an issue that I've not reflected on, and I have no knowledge on at this point.
Okay, would you be, having heard the issue outlined, would you be supportive of giving the Greens a dedicated question every week?
Generally speaking, I think the rules allow for official parties to have questions, and then beyond that, I'd have to reflect with my team. But the general idea being an official party should ask questions makes sense to me. But beyond that, I'll certainly take a look at that and reflect on it.
But she's not an official party. Like, they don't have, so are you being, I just want to be clear on your response. Are you saying that because she's not an officially recognized party in the House, the Greens shouldn't be allowed to ask a question? Or are you talking about the Greens being like an official party, like because they have members, they can participate in the election debates? I just want to be clear on what exactly it is that you're saying.
Well, right now, since they're not official party, I think that they operate just like an independent, a rotation every so often, and I think that system was put in place to reflect the will of the people, and that an official party has certain abilities to represent people more than independents do, and I understand that. Beyond that, I'd have to reflect on it some more to give you a more thorough answer. But the idea of official parties having a position in Parliament and independents having less of a ability to participate because they're not a part of a party has been something that has been decided as a part of our electoral system.
Thank you very much. I see no more questions. Je ne vois plus de questions. Alors, ceci conclut notre conférence de presse. This concludes our press conference. Jagmeet, if you'd like to say a few words closing before we go ahead.
Certainly. Again, I want to thank Mustafa Farooq and the SCCM for all their tireless advocacy. Again, I want to say to everyone across Canada who is grieving today, I know that seeing that attack, knowing that people, when they're going to somewhere to reflect and to pray and to be in a peaceful space, were so violently killed, is shocking. I remember the shock when I learned of it. I remember the shock that my friends, Muslim friends and dear ones were going through. That pain and that shock stays with us all. And it is not enough, though, for leaders to talk about the pain and shock without committing to real action. And today is about that commitment. We need to see all parties commit to real action, to fight the root cause of this and not be afraid of pointing out white supremacy and extreme right-wing groups that are openly promoting hate and violence. That is a clear key to fighting to getting to the root cause of this. And it is so essential that we do something in the memory of those lives lost to stop this from ever happening again. Thank you once again to everyone participating. Merci infiniment pour la participation de tout le monde, en particulier Mustafa Farooq. Et aujourd'hui, c'est une journée d'agir. Il faut agir pour prévenir ce sort de violence dans l'avenir. Oui, il faut rappeler des pertes de vie, mais pour reconnaître la valeur de leur vie, il faut s'engager à faire quelque chose de concret pour prévenir cette violence dans l'avenir. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. This concludes our press conference.